Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Vanessa McDonnell, and I am the co-director of the University of Ottawa Public Law Centre. We're a centre that thinks, writes, speaks, and tweets about all things public law. And this morning, it's a real pleasure to be able to bring this event to you, an event that is being hosted by the Public Law Centre, but also the Shirley Greenberg Chair for Women in the Legal Profession, the Ottawa Law Review, and the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue. I this morning am situated on Algonquin territory, and so I'd like to open this webinar today by paying respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land, and to acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. As I mentioned, one of the sponsors of this event is the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, and I would be remiss this morning if I didn't acknowledge the recent passing of Alex Trebek, an alumnus of the University of Ottawa who has given very generously of his time and his resources to allow our research community to thrive. And so we pay respect to him today. Comme j'ai mentionné, on est vraiment chanceux aujourd'hui d'avoir la chance de parler avec deux chercheurs très distingués. It's a real honor to be able to welcome two very distinguished researchers this morning. I will begin by introducing today's moderator, Natasha Bakht. Natasha Bakht is a full professor of law at the University of Ottawa, as well as Shirley Greenberg Chair for Women and the Legal Profession. Her research interests are generally in the area of law, culture, and minority rights, most notably in the intersecting area of religious freedom and women's equality. Professor Bakht's research on the niqab analyzes the unwarranted popular panic concerning Muslim women who cover their faces and explores systemic barriers to inclusion perpetuated by Canada's legal and political systems. Professor Bakht has a brand new book out called In Your Face, which has just been released in the last few weeks that deals with these issues. Our speaker today is Sherene Razack, who is a distinguished professor and the Penny Kanner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. As a feminist critical race scholar, her research and teaching focus on racial violence. She's best known for her contributions to feminist and critical race studies about discrimination against Muslim and Indigenous women in Canada, systemic racism in the Canadian justice system, and colonial violence against Indigenous peoples worldwide. So I'd like to, at this time, turn things over to Professor Razack to open with her talk this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good morning to everyone out there. It's really sad that I can't be doing this in person. We had planned to do this 9 months ago, and it seems very bizarre and ominous that we're still doing it this way. Okay, I'm very grateful to have been invited to give this talk, and particularly at this time, because I'm putting together several pieces and revising several pieces of my work into a book. I want to just briefly sort of tell you about the book as a way of introducing the talk. So I've titled the book, Nothing Has to Make Sense: Anti-Muslim Racism, White Supremacy, and Law. And in this book, I trace how white subjects and white nations consolidate their whiteness through the figure of the Muslim. And what I argue is that nothing has to make sense in law when the subject is Muslim. I maintain that the legal and cultural sites where you find Muslims really are sites where you see dread, phobia, hysteria, desire, everything but logic. And I emphasize in this book the affective dimensions of anti-Muslim racism. And really I'm sort of building towards thinking about how global white supremacy is currently organized and what role the figure of the Muslim plays in global white supremacy. And so I'm hoping in this book to offer some insight into the networks, the affinities, the ideas, and perhaps above all, the emotions on which all this depends, and the white subjects it produces and sustains. So that's the book. And because this is a seminar directed, I think, at law students and others in law, I want to explain that the central argument of the book is that a miasma of incoherence surrounds the Muslim in law. We become reconciled to the implausibility of the statements pronounced about Muslims in legal settings. We come to rely on our senses and our emotions, and in our heads, the deep misogyny of bearded Muslim patriarchs and duped and intransigent wearers of niqabs and hijabs. These all are circulating well before any words about them penetrate our consciousness. And what is declared true about Muslims really kind of slams into our stomach with all the force of racial insult and injury. And it ought to be shocking, but it is a feature of our times that it is not. What do we make of judges insisting that Muslim women uncover? What do we make of expert witnesses who say that Muslims have a catastrophically damaged gene pool? We're able to believe in these kinds of statements and in the racial science that is being peddled here because the subject who is discussed is somebody already known to us. If we're momentarily disturbed by the incoherence, and we are, when we remember where these statements are being uttered, they're being uttered in a court of law, often by white actors. If we're momentarily disturbed, we turn to what Colin Diane has called the fictions of law. And we believe, for example, that law is autonomous and objective and is not a party to the violence. This is, of course, law students, I think, are still being taught that lawyering entails rising above the emotional reactions that we feel, engaging in dispassionate analysis. None of this you see in trials, in hearings, in anything dealing with Muslims. And that it was really the striking incoherence that led me to want to organize my work into this book. So I want to just say that ideas about damaged gene pools, for example, ride in on racial feeling. And although law's fictions are daunting, we readily believe in them. I also want to say, just as a preliminary, I'm hoping this has gone away as the discussion about anti-Muslim racism has progressed a bit in the last few years, but not always. So let me just say that although often described as, merely a religious minority, Muslims in the West are fully racialized. They are regarded as the bearers of an incomplete humanity, undeserving of full personhood in law. I prefer the term anti-Muslim racism over the more popular term, it seems, Islamophobia. And what I really emphasize in my work is diverse projects of race making that are linked together in this global structure of white supremacy. As many have shown, a religion becomes a race when, regardless of phenotype, Muslims are lumped into one cultural group, a group that is thought to engage in practices that are regarded as uncivilized and uniquely threatening to white Christendom. The denigration of Muslims' assumed cultural practices soon melds into a kind of biological racism when arguments are made in legal spaces, such as Guantanamo's military hearings, that Muslims possess a cultural incapacity, a cultural capacity for violence. And it is a trait that their children inherit. So you have that sort of biological strata running through it. And the category Muslim is obviously a very capacious one. It moves very flexibly from the former colonized to those who lead lives of deep faith, to those who do not, to those who look like Muslims, those who live in the same areas as Muslims or proxies for them. It's a very capacious category. Okay, so let me begin with the title of the talk today. I want to keep an eye on the time because I always go over. This is the chapter in the book called Desiring Muslim Women. I wonder if you could put up the screen that gives the epigraphs to my chapter. I'm not sure if you put it up or not. Okay, so I hope you put it up. Okay. It's not for Vanessa, it's for the webinars manager to put up the screen. Okay, well, I'll just carry on. So the chapter is called Desiring Muslim Women, and it has a sort of subtitle that is a quote from a politician who is responding to a woman wearing the niqab. He's on a radio station with her, a French politician. And he says to her in great frustration, "I can never tell if you're responding to my smile." So there are two quotes that I want you to, keep in mind as sort of the epigraphs to this chapter. "We do not master by seeing. We are ourselves altered when we look." And that's from Anne Cheng. And the second one from Henk van Houten, "What do we fear and desire when faced with the walls that we've raised around ourselves?" So those are things to keep in mind. We're not putting up this screen, but there was a screen of Muslim bans by country in Europe. And what you see when you look at that map is that virtually everywhere in Europe, and it's already outdated, I'm sure, you see all kinds of bans, niqab bans, hijab bans, minaret bans, burkini bans, etc., all through Europe. So maybe keep that in mind as well. So let me start with this. In early 2017, an Australian television station sent a reporter clothed in a niqab to a mall. And within seconds of appearing at the mall, the reporter encountered a highly irate white man screaming abuses. "Did you come here on a boat? Where's your effing face?" As he screamed at her, passers-by looked on, saying nothing. The confrontation is notable for the hierarchy of citizenship that is performed. An angry, threatening white man disciplines a woman he assumes to be a refugee. It's not hard to pin down the high emotion that the man displays. The encounter is unmistakably gendered, boiling with rage, and what Maida Geneglu called, following Fanon, frustrated imperial ambition. Suffused with longing, "Yield to me, be grateful to me," scenes such as these and the imperial sentiments they reveal animate legal projects aimed at banning the wearing of Muslim women's head coverings. Properly chastened, the covered Muslim woman must either yield to her challenger or be legally banned from public space. As Fanon described for colonial Algeria, the rending of the Algerian woman's veil is an erotically charged act. "Straight off," he said, "with the maximum of violence, there is possession, rape, and near murder." Unveiling provides the colonizer with power over the Algerian man, Fanon suggested, and also with a practical, effective means of destroying Algerian culture. It also increased the colonizer's aggressiveness. For her part, the woman wearing the veil seems to prefer estrangement rather than risk the form of recognition that the man is prepared to grant her. She refuses to meet him on his terms. The violence and intense emotion of the scene in the mall and its equivalent in the courtroom pushes me in the same direction of psychoanalysis as Fanon, although I hasten to say that I'm not in a position to offer a fully fleshed out psychoanalytic account as he was. I want to understand what is at stake for today's white Western subjects in these social moments. I find myself having to think more about the role of fantasy and the nature of the subject, whose coherence, as seen on the video, cannot withstand the sight of a covered woman. Just as a side note to those listening for the psychoanalysis, I am blurring the phantasmatic, which refers to the conscious mind, and the phantasmic, which refers to the unconscious mind. It's a bit sloppy there, and many apologies to the real theorists of psychoanalysis in the crowd. The sexual nature of the responses to the Muslim woman wearing the niqab, the command to her to yield to the white masculine and sometimes the white feminine gaze, prompts me to consider desire. Bans in the West reroute desire, damming up its flow and removing from sight the object of desire, declaring the Muslim woman a sight we cannot bear. In seeking to exercise sovereignty over Muslim women's bodies, bans are a key part of maintaining a global color line in which white nations establish supremacy through the regulation of Muslim populations. Through bans, Muslim women experience their subordination in intimate ways. Their communities learn of their subordinate place in the structure of citizenship. Equally, through bans, Europe, North America become one community structured by the eviction of Muslims from political community. An intensified global anti-Muslim affect circulates, and it underwrites all kinds of political projects, from the control of asylum seekers in Europe, for example, to internal contestations over the meaning of white nationalism, as it does in Canada. The Muslim is confirmed as antithetical to Western modernity, and a white global community solidifies in the wake of this powerful mythology, bringing together the right and the left, the white right and the white left, as each is revitalized over the affirmation of an essential Europeanness. Bans on Muslim women's clothing reveal what, in the words of Jan Petarsi, the sensuous and subliminal dimensions of politics, that is to say, the aesthetics of white power in law across the West. A virulent anti-Muslim racism is sweeping the globe, traveling on virtual pathways such as YouTube, where I found the video. It's a circulating affect, and it is depositing in individual psyches what we need to shape future encounters between ourselves and those we label Muslim women, Muslim-looking. Replaying the video, for example, before giving a public talk one time, I was very unpleasantly reminded of the power of these affective roots. As I retrieved my baggage from the carousel at the airport in Toronto, a woman wearing a niqab accidentally bumped into me with her suitcase in the very crowded terminal. And instantly, the man's ugly words popped into my head. And although I didn't utter them, I felt the emotion that I felt in my effort to stop myself from bringing the words to my lips really shook me to the core. It is notable that anti-Muslim racism, the anti-Muslim racism of public culture, mostly circulates vertically. That is, from elites to ordinary people, gathering strength on its journey downwards. Former President Trump's tweets, sharing an incendiary video of Muslim Representative Ilhan Omar, for instance, spawned a number of death threats against us. More alarming, such acts have lethal and international impact. You know, of course, that shortly after the Muslim travel ban was first instituted in the United States in 2016, a Canadian white nationalist, Alexandre Bissonnette, whose Facebook page linked him to President Trump and to a number of white nationalist websites, walked into a mosque in Quebec City and shot 6 worshippers. A similarly inspired white nationalist killed 50 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. In both instances, apologists rushed to comment that the men were genuinely concerned about the threats facing the West from Muslims. In fact, Bissonnette has since been shown in the news, Canadian news, during his police interrogation in a virginal white jumpsuit, not an orange one, softly explaining that he thought his own family was under threat of a possible attack from terrorists. So it is elite and everyday anti-Muslim racism undergird a number of legal projects globally that target Muslims. In this climate of intensified racial violence, and it is of course not only against Muslims, it is politically urgent to consider legal bans of all kinds and to examine their connection to racial violence. You are, of course, as Canadians, if I'm addressing Canadians, you never know virtually who you're addressing, but you know that you're in the middle, for instance, of a ban, the government of Quebec's Bill 21, which is currently being challenged in court. That bill makes it unlawful to give or receive a public service while wearing religious symbols. You'll know that all kinds of workers will then be challenged, public service workers, police officers, prison guards, teachers, etc. In the challenges to the bill being heard this week in Superior Court, the Quebec government argued that the bill expresses the will of the people and their unease, I like that word, over the place of religion in public life. So willing to trespass on the rights of its Muslim majority, the state's case highlights with very little subtlety that there is a dominant majority in culture that must be protected from Muslims. I suggest that these arguments work affectively, and they are productive, installing a color line with very little effort. It's difficult to imagine that basic rights will be honored in such a climate. Who will hire anyone remotely associated with Islam? Who will be civil? Will there be more shootings? If a murderous white rage against Muslims circulates in the West, a rising tide of fundamentalist religious movements is also sweeping the globe and often traveling along the same virtual pathways. Regardless of her own intentions, the covered woman is seen as a bearer of Islamist rather than Islamic ideals. At a time when fundamentalist movements of all kinds are really stepping up their efforts to control women. In the United States, Christians seeking to ban women's right to choose, Hindu varieties in India, etc. If she arouses the ire of entitled and aggressive white men in North America and Europe, white men and women bent on managing public space, she also signals, and some would say aggressively so and in your face, as Natasha's book announces, she signals the increasing presence of a religiosity that clearly announces women's subordination to men, or clearly in some views announces women's subordination to men. So feminists have had a difficult time with this. I note that a few days ago that, one of the arguments in court about Bill 21 is that children must be protected from this message of gender inequality, never mind what other messages we're sending them by banning it. And so feminists have been quite conflicted about it. I want to add my own feminist voice to these debates, and in my navigation of the political spaces, between state anti-Muslim racism and religious extremism, I really focus primarily on the niqab and its cousin, the burqa, the latter typically associated with Afghanistan and with terrorism. It is the niqab wearer who gives rise to high anxiety in the West, although there's plenty of opposition to the hijab or headscarf. We need to ask why the niqab unsettles and who is unsettled by it. And what I suggest, just in as concisely as possible, the niqab generates a deep anxiety surrounding knowing and possessing the woman who is covered. They express a command to Muslim women to yield to racial and sexual superiority. And what is unbearable is her refusal to yield to the Western gaze. So I'd like to make my case around desire, possession, and the limits of imperial ambition. I want to say that when you turn to the legal cases banning the niqab, and the hijab for that matter, if you focus on the phantasmatic scenes of their legal geography, you find that the cases really rest on very flimsy legal logic. The idea, for instance, that the face is necessary for social interaction. These weak lines of argument and the strong emotions that generate bans are very revealing of the racial fantasy that animates them. The law turns on racial fantasy. Okay, so the argument that I make around possession and imperial desire contradicts the official reasons that are given whenever bans are put in place. For example, for the Quebec government, of course, banning public sector workers from wearing the hijab or the niqab is defended as necessary in a secular society and one in which gender equality is a preeminent value. Although bans are typically accompanied by regressive anti-immigration policies and by an escalating racism and violence, their racial basis is obscured by these arguments about secularism and gender equality. Such arguments invoke the state as neutral arbiter, and their proponents de-emphasize the West's racial political projects. So, although I believe that the global threat of fundamentalist religion and its misogyny must always be central to feminist calculations, I maintain that the same global analytic must be extended to the threat that is posed by white supremacy and the control of racial populations throughout the West. Okay, so let us go to the phantasmatic scenes. And I want to begin with a case that many of you know, and Natasha has written about this case brilliantly, R versus NS. It's a sexual assault case, and I start with the case because it is a sexual assault case. In R versus NS, the complainant, sexual assault complainant, wanted to wear her niqab while testifying. She alleged that 2 of her male relatives had sexually assaulted her since childhood. She'd tried to do something about it for years. Finally, now in a court of law, she's prepared to testify, and her accused make the argument that her right to a fair trial is impaired if we can't see her face. The lower court agreed, ruling in favor of the accused. Surely a stellar moment, one of the very few times that the court rules in favor of Muslim accused men, and particularly on the issue of sexual assault. So NS appealed to the Supreme Court to wear her niqab, and the majority opinion rejected her claim, although it tried to do so in highly sophisticated terms by announcing that Canada doesn't uncritically remove religion from the courtroom. We know that minority practices must be protected, but you know, we have a problem with this wearing of the niqab, and the whole thing rested, as Natasha Bakht carefully unpacks, rested on the idea that we need to see her face and be able to judge whether she's telling the truth or lying that way. So from the outset, this seems to rely on sort of arguments that have long ago sort of gone away. The unreliability of demeanor evidence, for example. The court seems to be operating the same way as the television show Lie to Me. If I can't see your face, then I won't know if you're lying or not. And I particularly appreciated Natasha Bakht's, questions in her article as to why is the court painting such an uncritical picture of demeanor, particularly in a case where full context is critical. Those are her words. And why is this court so remarkably inflexible and uncreative? Why has it been able to do better on sexual assault in other cases? So I really want to run with these questions and to go with Bakht's focus on Mr. Justice Louis Lebel, whose confirming opinion really offers, I think, the best indicator of what is at stake. Bakht describes his utter disapproval you know, isn't it important the way in which these emotions just pervade these legal cases? Utter disapproval. The niqab is considered to operate as a shield between NS and the public. We won't be able to tell if she's lying. Here you have the phantom of the foreign woman who does not truly love us, who lies to us, who rejects us. All of this peeps through the judge's disapproval. The niqab wearer is rendered as a censorious guest who disdains her host, who disturbs by her unbecoming behavior a normally harmonious event. Recall that all of this is happening in the context of sexual assault. Appointing himself as the guardian of Canadian values, chief among them a secularism that must guard against a religious and excessive religiosity, the Belgian takes the trouble of noting that we're in a time of increased migration where the need to protect Canadian values from foreign intrusion is urgent. Aha, the heuristic device is clearly announced here. Full and open communication requires seeing someone's face. Seeing someone's face is a fundamental value in an open and secular society, and it is a society that must be protected from an onslaught of foreignness. The niqab is also unfair because we can't see how justice works. We can't participate in justice under these conditions. And again, I'm with Natasha Bakht when she says, you know, what is this irrational insistence on seeing one's face? Where is this exaltation of face-to-face interaction coming from? Well, we do actually sort of know where it's coming from. The threatening foreigner, the phantom figure of our unconscious who reconciles us to any gaps in rationality in the courtroom, is also very much present in a number of other bands, both in Europe and a few fledgling ones in Canada. You will recall Jason Kenney when he was Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism under the government of Stephen Harper, introducing a ban on the wearing of the niqab while taking the oath of citizenship. Kenney in this effort really reveals once again the exaltation of the face-to-face encounter and really emphasizes that a person wearing a niqab is an affront in your face. I think these are so important. Once again, we have the censorious guest who is disruptive, who doesn't like us. In Kenney's decision, he actually makes quite clear in all the discourses around this that really this is not about you know, an actual problem of thousands of niqab wearing women. What he announces is that the real problem is threatening difference. There's nothing coded about this. His rhetoric really organizes the pursuit of the niqab wearing woman. When she's caught, the moment is marked by the cry, "Yield to me or else." It matters little that the law organizes the chase on the strength of the logic that an oath that is spoken behind the veil is not an oath. Nothing has to make sense. The dogged insistence on homogeneity and protection from a threatening foreignness resolves the incoherence, and it conceals what is at stake. It is a circulating affect, and we need to follow it as it moves through the world. Bans draw on a shared repository of European civilizational superiority. Each nation takes care to dress the rationales for bans in local fabric, styles that make bans acceptable to the public and to law, and that obscures histories of colonialism and racism. The French, for example, they dress their ban in the notion that the French nation believes in living together, vivre ensemble, an abstract concept if there ever was one. What is important to me is that scholars, so many scholars, critical scholars as well, so many scholars insist that this is really a debate about democracy and not a debate at all about Muslims. So, for example, Baer and Gordon insist that really, if we want to understand the origin of French bans, we need to appreciate French democratic traditions. They assert that the push to ban the burqa in France is really a debate about democracy, independent of racial or gender prejudice. And explaining why, comparatively, this amuses me, they say, Americans have not favored legal bans on the hijab. They do a whole bunch of other things, but they're not really concerned about this particular thing. And Baer and Gordon say, well, the reason they're not concerned about this particular thing is because, unlike Europe, they don't really rely on their social theorists who can explain to them the full meaning of democracy. Americans should be quite insulted by this. Racism against Muslims is seen then as unconnected to legal responses to Muslim women. Laicité, reciprocity, these things are discussed as abstract principles without histories or context. They're invoked by political actors who believe in the purity of democracy. These kinds of scholarly interpretations really preempt the question of what the invocation of democratic principles such as this do in the present. As Mayathi Fernando warns, the anxious invocation of secularism as the basis of French national identity is not simply due to the Republic's contemporary tensions with the formerly colonized, although it is that, but is instead linked to long-standing contestations over the meaning of Frenchness. So why is all of this happening? Another apparently critical scholar, Anne Norton from Princeton, believes that we have to assist the Muslim to enter modernity. She adds that Europe is embarrassed that its much vaunted tolerance is not possible with respect to Muslims. We just can't do it because Muslims remind us of who we were. We were traditional. We were given over to religion too. We don't like them for reminding us of our archaic past. In this explanation, it is not considered that really we don't like them for having to share the nation with them. We see in all of the cases the same figures: the foreign woman who will not love us, the offended original citizens whose culture is fragile and cannot bear such intrusions. In July 2014, the European Commission on Human Rights dealt with a very important case, SAS versus France, and the issue there was once again whether the state should be allowed to criminalize the wearing of full-face veils in public spaces. Once again, we see the arguments of living together. We see the niqab wearing woman or the burqa wearing woman as imagined as someone who is breaking the social tie. She's manifesting a refusal of the principle of living together. This, you see this echoed everywhere. And even though a couple of judges actually say that living together is really quite far-fetched and vague a goal, in fact, the majority decision is that she has to remove her, SAS has to remove her niqab. French public discourse has been entirely structured around the exaltation of face-to-face interaction and the notion of a society under threat from foreign values. As in other moments of collective fantasy, things do not have to make sense. This is not about logic, but about racial phantoms and racial feeling. It is instructive, for instance, that the philosopher Levinas was widely misused to confirm that one cannot participate in society unless the full face is revealed. This logic was all over the Sherene Parliamentary Commission, which was a commission of inquiry created in France in 2009 to explore the wearing of the niqab, burqa, and any form of veil. In fact, as Cindy Patton has explained and so many others, the passage attributed to Levinas was not written by him at all and is a deliberate misreading. It's an astonishing error that is allowed to persist. It's an alternative fact, if you like. When many French professors, who should know better, aren't they the ones who know very much about social theory, they joined in misinterpreting Levinas. Kirsten Wesselhoff, and in fact a number of scholars, have offered a really useful analysis of the testimonies given to the Sherene Commission. And what her analysis shows is the importance of the specific notion of gender that is invoked in the collective fantasy of unveiling. So the Sherene Commission heard from 210 individuals. There's almost a 700-page report. Wesselhoff remarks on the paradoxes and the contradiction that mark them. Again, not rationality, full of paradox, full of contradiction. Strikingly emotional in tone, these testimonies offer unvarnished expressions of French superiority. First of all, there's the paradox of femininity, where the full face veil is read as the reduction of a woman to her femininity, but also a negation of her ability to express her femininity, and so on. Lots of paradoxes. But what I'm really concerned with is the way in which gender, the story of gender that is told by those wishing to ban the veil, is a story that comes into operation through a story about race, a story about the superiority of French culture. Gender, French academics explained to the Sherene Commission, is about the right to a free sexuality, the right not to be a virgin on your wedding day, the right not to answer to anyone. And these are all uniquely French values. For some, it boils down to the right to wear skirts. Elizabeth Badinter, a feminist philosopher, warned that if we allowed this, impressionable young girls will not know how to resist their families. The wearing of skirts expresses a specific French femininity to which the girls must have access. French politicians were troubled and worried that women would no longer be free to seduce men, and presumably not free to be seduced either. So it is tempting to dismiss such arguments, to see their illogic and their contradiction. Perhaps my tone reveals some of that. But they make two things abundantly clear. First, a single notion of what gender means is the foundation of the civilizational divide between Muslims and the French. Those who refuse to perform this version of femininity are simply pre-modern or anti-modern and cannot be part of the nation. A universal notion of gender thus relies upon the example of the oppressed third world woman as necessary backdrop to convey the superiority of a Western notion of gender. This was an argument, I think I made it in, I'm sure I made it in Looking White People in the Eye, and thousands of feminists of color have made it for a while. In fact, as Ray Chow argued some time ago, what we see in moves such as this is the rise of femininity as a form of racial power. I would like to add to this argument a second point. The emphasis on seduction is telling. It announces desire and a considerable anxiety. As Fanon saw with the French in Algeria, the woman who sees without being seen frustrates the colonizer. As he said, there's no reciprocity. She doesn't yield. She doesn't give herself. She doesn't offer herself. This is a problem. Gendered colonial frustration really mark the pages of the Sherene report. Citizens are wounded by the aggressive acts of the niqab wearer. Abdinar Bidar, for instance, a philosopher and specialist in Islam, and like Badinter, one of the most quoted academics, made the argument that he as an individual suffers from violence when he can't see the face of the other. His suffering, I put to you, is none other than rejection. The public must be protected from the affront of not being desired and the suffering such a rejection causes. So I want to consider these testimonials to the Sherene Commission, where the niqab is understood as psychic disruption and as giving offense, alongside of theories of colonial fantasies, examining whose pleasure is the state resolved to protect. As May Diagenoglu powerfully argued some years ago in her book, Colonial Fantasies, the veil and the niqab are the sites of an enduring colonial fantasy, the place where discourses of sexual and colonial difference are powerfully mapped onto each other. Fascination, anger, and frustration coalesce around the idea that the veiled woman is refusing to yield. Unavailable, she is an enigma who is simultaneously feared and desired. Without her unveiling, the Western man and the Western woman cannot know himself or herself as being in control, as sovereign, and as desired. And as Diagenoglu pointed out long ago, the metaphysical will to know gains a sexual overtone. Troubled with this mask, the Western subject is threatened and seduced at the same time. The rending of the veil enables access and possession. The erotics of possession shed light on the psychic and sexualized underpinnings of anti-Muslim racism. Who is the subject who must engage in the erotically charged act of unveiling? In LaBelle J's opinion, in the Sherene report, we clearly see the subject who must engage straight away in the violence of possession, rending the veil and revealing the truth. In this instance, of course, what is revealed is only a woman. Her subordinate status, racially and sexually inflected, becomes discernible in the moment that she's made to yield. So let me briefly discuss another sort of psychoanalytic move. I sometimes feel like I'm playing in a game that don't know that well. To further trace the psychic underpinnings of bans and to bring into view the subject whose coherence is secured through the eviction of Muslim women from public space, it is useful to employ a spatial analytic and to examine how it is that spatial categories are also racial categories and how they are a defense against anxiety. An expulsion of the subject, who is the source of the anxiety, is the defense. So bans expel from civic life Muslim women who are covered, and they are an example of the constitutive violence that is required to make a public. They create a public that is made secure by the eviction of a threatening foreignness. Banning the niqab protects the public from challenges to the meaning of gender as we know it. She's not sexually available, she cannot be possessed. Lauren Ballant suggests that the immigrant is defined as someone who desires America. She's speaking of America. She said, immigrant women, for instance, are especially valued for having the courage to grasp freedom, a freedom defined as the free choice of love object. As she concludes, women of color, and in this respect, especially Muslim women today, confirm not only that freedom and democracy exists, but also that in America, but also that Americans are desirable. And in her refusal to be possessed, she is endangering all of this. So I wanted to think about sites that we find unbearable, sites that must be banned. And here I drew upon Susan Schweik's extraordinary book, The Ugly Laws, which were laws that banned unsightly beggars. They prevailed for almost a century until the 1970s. And so Schweik was exploring these ugly laws and wondering how it came to be that unsightly beggars were banned. And she notes that there's a considerable amount of ambivalence in the banning in this moment where we're recognizing disability and unsightliness. And perhaps the ambivalence is get out of my sight because you disturb me, but also there but for the grace of God go I. So these ugly laws are inspired by fear of civic contagion and outbreak of imperfect bodies. And they raise anxieties about how these bodies have come to be. How did they come into existence? Was it the war? Was it the bad anxiety? Schweik really encouraged, her work encouraged me to think about my own distress about the niqab, at least a part of my unease comes from my own insecure access to the space of the citizen. If any Muslimness in my biography must be erased as the premise of citizenship, then those who go around making public their own Muslimness will elicit unwelcome attention to those of us assumed to be Muslim and foreign. As a woman, of course, I also possess an insecure access to citizenship. Those who reveal the secret of the nation, that it is patriarchal, often have to pay for it. Women, including veiled women, must demonstrate that we like our subjection. We must make ourselves available, untroubled by unwelcome and often violent sexual attention. I wonder if the niqab-wearing woman thumbs her nose at patriarchy, I cannot be possessed, or publicly embraces it, I will be modest, as is demanded of women. Either way, she introduces a conversation many of us would rather not have at this particular moment. It's hard not to wish that she would simply go away, a nuisance at best, a dangerous and unsettling provocation at worst. So the niqab wearer disturbs the unity of the public sphere. As she moves through the public sphere, she's threatening and disturbing. We project onto her an aggression that the law performs. The niqab wearer is experienced as powerful and powerfully disturbing, as in your face. She inspires all kinds of aggressive acts, pulling the covering from her head. We imagine that she's covering her body for antisocial reasons, just as beggars were seen as exposing their unsightly body for the purpose of begging, and we resent them both. Schweik notes that the beggars were imagined as flaunting their difference. For the crime of flaunting, ugly laws instituted harsh policing, systematized suspicion, suppression of acts of solidarity with beggars. You couldn't be on their side, and structural and institutional repulsion. It's useful to recall that French laws banning the headscarf relied on the logic that religion must not be flaunted in public space. Flaunting one's difference, a sentiment behind laws that seek to regulate sexuality, is a powerful inversion of the violence that the law performs. It is the law that flaunts an imagined bodily homogeneity and expels that which would undermine its own coherence. Such legally authorized aggression handily obscures how bodies come to be ugly and begging in the first place, just as bans on the niqab obscure how the nation comes to constitute itself as only white, Christian, and defined by women's sexual availability. Two figures emerge in the colonial fantasy of Muslim women: a veiled woman, perhaps intent on tearing apart the fiction of homogeneity and perhaps not, and her slighted, vengeful lover, who mourns the intimacies he or she now actively repudiates. We see frustrated imperial ambition and sights we cannot bear in legal and social encounters, a sometimes irrational insistence that the veiled or covered woman yield to those who would possess her. Let me spare a quick thought for variations on this. Here I want to take seriously repugnance or disgust, emotions that establish social hierarchies. Disgust, as Miller and others have argued, ranks people. Far from being natural, disgust is productive. It evicts from our consideration anyone who impairs the maintenance of self we need to establish belonging. It's a nervous claim, as Miller suggests. The readiness to demand a legal solution to the problem of disgust is a distinctive feature of modern society, an indicator perhaps of the collective anxieties of racial and colonial states. So I want to suggest that we might consider our desires to ban the niqab wearer, the hijab wearer, as a kind of stalking. Gus and Hage discusses in the Australian context citizens who want to manage public space and pull the veils off the heads of women. We might add that these citizens are driven to act on their feelings of disgust. And as we've seen in the cases of legal bans, such acts reach their apotheosis when the state itself performs its own unveiling. So the aggression behind such enactments of citizenship suggests that something very deeply psychically structured is at stake. The niqab wearer, I want to put it to you, is someone who is stalked. A vengeful lover stalks her. So there is, plenty of evidence of these kinds of emotions, such as the original opening quote to this chapter, French politicians saying to niqab wearers, "I can't tell if you're responding to my smile," or else they say, "Stop lying to me," to the niqab wearer. Again, I recall Anne Cheng's remarks. What does unveiling, when understood as an act of possession, provide to those who are compelled to engage in it? We do not master by seeing. We are ourselves altered when we look. To look at the niqab is to be altered, to be derailed from the path of racial and sexual mastery, and to be confronted with the possibility that we do not know either who she is or who we are. Faced with the prospect of alteration, we choreograph the encounter with Muslim women through bans on her apparel. Bans enable us to refuse to see, to block from our line of vision the sight that unsettles and that derails us from our plans of mastery. As dreams of possession, bans preempt any recognition of the other's humanity and seek to ensure that we are not troubled by it. So let me end by saying that the question I want to consider is, why are we unable to grant to Muslims what has been regarded as a rock bottom minimum, the right to live in the world as they see fit? Why is this minimum so hard to offer to conservative Muslims? And what is the cost of not offering it? So this refusal to be in proximity, which is actually Levinas's words, the refusal to be made awake to the other's difference, the refusal to contemplate a diverse humanity and femininity. What is this all about? Other than an endlessly repeated, "the face must be seen," there's little substance, still less appeal, even to pragmatic considerations. These legal scenes are full of phantasmatic scenes. It is not surprising that so many scholars writing critically about bans return to Levinas and ask about how we could, as he asked, engage with the other without reducing her to an extension of ourselves, an object of the gaze. How might we bear the niqab, even knowing that its wearers are bearers of Islamist ideologies? These are questions that pervade a number of legal scenes. Corporeal evictions from political community have been proliferating. You've heard about burkini bans. You've heard of a number of other bans sweeping through Europe. Toni Morrison once urged a graduating class to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where the solution of serious learned people to practically every big problem was not to kill somebody. In the same spirit, I propose that we imagine a world where bans are not the solution to every problem with Muslims. Although I acknowledge my own impoverished imagination in this regard, I feel deep apprehension about what bans do. And I want to urge us to heed Morrison's advice. And perhaps, as she advised, stop turning to the law as first and last resort. Law continues to attract Islamists and their opponents alike. So bans in the West, I conclude, unfold in the historical and legal record as extraordinary and violent moments of longing and repugnance, moments born of dreams of possession. They unfold not only as the dreams of secularists, but also of Christian religious conservatives and Zionists in the United States. Such are the paradoxes of the field where men and women meet to orchestrate the control of women and races through bans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherene. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Your work is, as always, so powerful and poignant. And I love the title of your new book, Nothing Has to Make Sense. I think that this is what is so incredible about niqab bans, is that they don't have to make sense. Law can simply abandon logic. And so we can have these absurd results, as in France, where in this global health pandemic, people are being fined for not wearing face masks, and niqab wearing women continue to be fined for wearing their niqabs. I was also really struck by your argument about the way in which this anti-Muslim affect circulates globally. And I was thinking in particular about the NS case and the way in which Justice LaBelle's concurrence really got taken up. So for all the Supreme Court of Canada's discussion about the accused's fair trial rights as the reason why NS had to unveil, when we had a niqab wearing accused in a case called the Queen and DR in England, suddenly, although that particular judge relied on the NS decision, we saw a complete disregard for her fair trial rights. There was no discussion about her as the accused's right to make full answer in defense. And instead, the judge really emphasized whether it was fair to ask a witness or a jury or a judge to perform their functions while not being able to see the defendant's face. So niqab-wearing women are sort of in this paradoxical situation where being a complainant who wears a face veil too greatly impacts the rights of others, and a niqab-wearing accused, the niqab-wearing complainant too greatly impacts the fair trial rights of the accused, but then the niqab-wearing accused too greatly impacts the rights of others. So we see this illogic, as you have sort of pointed out, with a number of examples. And it makes me think, and you've pointed to this already, is that these bans are not about evidence, they're not about logic. They're about these emotions of disgust or fear or dislike. So I'm wondering, and you might have already answered this question in your last sentence or two of your talk, but do you think emotions can be harnessed for a progressive politics in law?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I think I want to answer it by talking about the fact that the place in law where this can happen is a structural place. It's formally there in American, among American scholars such as Colin Diane, but lots of other people. That space is described as the space that is reserved in law for the slave. And in that space in law, where the phantom slave dwells, nothing has to make sense. Toni Morrison, actually, it's from her that I take the title, because she was saying, you know, we have a law where a Black girl is in the emergency and she's completely injured and damaged, and she ends up being, she's a survivor of sexual assault, and she ends up being convicted of raping and defiling herself. And Toni Morrison said, where does this happen in law? This happens when the figure of the slave enters law. So if you take, so that's a, you know, it might sound like a very sort of American-based argument, but if you take from that, you know, broaden the argument and sort of go along with Denise da Silva and lots of others, we see that it is in fact a feature of law, that when the subject who is deemed, as Denise poetically put it, to be on the other side of universality, the subject who is not of the world of reason, when that subject enters law, law's objective is to evict that subject from the law. And so I think that the Muslim is actually entering a space in law that is always there. It is a space of raciality. And so emotions betray that we're in the presence of the space of raciality. It tells us that. And so could there actually be other emotions? Well, you have to think about what the space of raciality is constituted by. It's constituted by real histories, long histories of ongoing colonialism, slave owning states. These things persist, and they persist materially. So the emotions that surround them are pretty powerful ones and hard to dislodge. So I don't know whether we could deploy emotions in the courtroom in other ways, which is truly, I find myself having to think very seriously with abolitionists, and to think very, very seriously with Morrison, who says, it's not about this. This is not where we're going to solve it. Mm-hmm. Which is a dreadful lesson. I could imagine all of the people listening who are in law school actually thinking, well, you're in a profession that is really fundamentally about maintaining a color line and trafficking racial narratives. That's what it's about.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I certainly often talk to my students about multiple avenues for change. And, while they might have chosen law school and might want to use the legal tools available, as they should, that, there are other avenues for change. But I want to sort of push you and ask you, how then do you reconcile the occasional, I will admit, the very occasional but important positive decision coming out of courtrooms, let's say, with respect to racialized people. And so in the context of the niqab, I'm thinking of Sherene Razack's case, where she fought the conservative government's policy that prohibited the taking of the oath of citizenship, as you described, while wearing her niqab, and she won. And very atypically, the Federal Court of Appeal rendered a decision from the bench and said, we're doing this so that Ms. Razack has the opportunity to get her citizenship in time to vote in the next federal election. And she did vote in the next federal election, and it was the election that removed Harper from power. So, is there a place at all for optimism in our understanding of race and law?
I always feel that sort of pessimism is not something that subordinate people can afford, so we really can't sort of engage in that. I will say this though, drawing perhaps on Gus Anhaj, who says it in a humorous way, but also brilliantly, that the place of raciality, the place of racism is always full of contradiction, all over the placeness, etc. You find the most incredible things there, including people honoring rights. So that is a kind of feature of race. So it's not that it surprises me. And would I put my faith in it? Well, to the extent that you have no other choice, really. In terms of, the old, I think Robert Williams said, if you're the one sent to the back of the bus, if you don't have that right, then you have to contest it. The question is, what do we think will do the trick? And we've seen that logic doesn't do it.
I just want to say to the people who are watching this webinar that you can ask Dr. Razack questions through the Q&A function, and then I will pose them to her. Let me just ask one last question. We've been having some really difficult conversations about racism at our institution, and I think many of us feel personally invested in these discussions, but for racialized students and racialized professors, in particular, there is a way in which our very bodies are on the line. You have been doing anti-racism and feminist work for decades now. That's a long struggle. We're of course training professionals, we're training lawyers to be in a professional program, but we're also human. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the way in which you have negotiated this work while still taking care of yourself and being healthy. Is there a space and a time in which you allow yourself to be hurt, to be unsure, to be vulnerable?
You know, I always run away from these questions of the personal, Natasha. And I really, you know, do have to say, I mean, look at the enormous privilege of my position. So what comes at me is so much less than what comes at, you know, other people, other groups. I mean, I live now in Los Angeles. I mean, there, you know, police violence every day, those kinds of things. But as academics, of course, there is a violence coming at you all the time. You know, for instance, you know, webinars that get taken down by Zoom if you attempt to talk about, be critical of Israel. This is a regular occurrence here. So these kinds of things, threats and feeling really bad about things and so on. And so I don't know, I wouldn't disavow that there isn't a significant personal impact, but I think the struggle is trying to remember what aspects of your power you do have to keep resisting these things. And I think the answer is for me, the same as it is for so many people, really, that this is collective. This is a collective struggle. I know very well that you're there at Ottawa U Law School. Actually, Zoom is a bit of a bonus for us because now I can see you and do politics with you. And in fact, I have a world community. And this has been the most extraordinary thing about this period, is that every day you can go on a webinar with some scholar you like or admire or whatever, and listen to them and take heart from them and organize with them. That's what I find truly remarkable, and probably the most remarkable of all, is that in our local sites, when we feel so besieged, it's very clear that this is a global issue and that we are globally organizing. That's the best thing about this, is that you need not stay in your room. Well, you have to stay in your room, but you need not feel you're alone. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I really, I can't tell you how that has been amidst all the protests and struggle and COVID, to understand we actually have a world community of people resisting this.
We've got a question from a person who is attending the webinar. Would you recommend that in our work, we engage in a language shift from Islamophobia to anti-Muslim racism?
Oh, I would be so grateful if everybody would move that way. Just because it's so tiring to endlessly make the case that this is about race, that this is racism. We know where we are. This is about race making. It is about white supremacy. And those kinds of things are very hard to introduce into a conversation about Islamophobia, because the emphasis seems to be put on Islam, as though there's something intrinsic about Islam. Is it the most misogynist religion? On and on we get into those kinds of discussions, and it takes us very far away from race making. So I would be so relieved if we could get into that. I would love it, love it, love it if every time I give a talk, it hasn't happened here, but you know, usually somebody says, I don't know why you're arguing that this is about racism, it's really about religion. Oh, I would so like to be beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another question. Can you share your thoughts on feminist struggles against compulsory hijab in Iran, for example? It's not often discussed in the post-colonial theorization on Muslim women.
You know, the biggest contestation that happens among feminists when it concerns these bans, it is the idea of secularism, and the idea that, as my good friend who may be listening, maybe I won't name her, but we've had a long-standing discussion about, you know, if you lived in Iran, if you lived in Pakistan, you would be a lot more alert to the evil that religious patriarchs do than you are to the evil that white supremacists do, to put it colloquially. Mm-hmm. And I take that because one must struggle with where you are. But even in the context of, say, you know, having to wear the hijab or you know, things like that, even there one must analyze how projects of rule operate through women's bodies. And even there, you would have to, you can't respond to this kind of organized religiosity, if you like, with a secularism that is untroubled by ideas of secularism as a project of rule itself. Like you can't sort of deploy strategies and constructs as though the world were not already riven through with racial projects of rule, with class projects of rule, with gendered hierarchies. We can never do that. And so I've many times tried to, you know, been in conversation with feminists from Iran, from other places, you know, trying to discuss what is a feminist response to this. And you can't, as I think one of the chapters in Casting Out said, you can't fight racism with sexism. You can't do these kinds of things. You have to collectively sort of analyze the project of rule in which you are, taking nothing for granted.
Okay, well, if you can believe it, we've come to the end of this wonderful session, and so I would just, you know, very briefly like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Bakht, our moderator today, and of course our speaker, Professor Razack. These are really important conversations. They're conversations that we need to continue having, and so I would like to thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.